This is Tom. Tom is now 79 years old, and he is one of the regulars at my work, and he has been for many, many years. He likes race car driving, ice cream, giving people tours around a restaurant. But recently, I found out that Tom is in the military, and he has been all over the world collecting stories through talking with others and hearing their perspectives on life. And at the end of every conversation, Tom would always say that he has lived one crazy, epic life. This is Alea. She's 19, now moved out, and works 2 jobs. She's always on the go. She grew up the mom of her household. As the oldest of 3 kids, she had to face every obstacle first before her siblings. She had to make dinner, wake them up in the mornings, and even drive them to school. But one thing about Alea is she is a lot stronger than she looks. I would know. She's my sister. This is Carol. She's a mom, a grandma. She loves hiking, nature, the outdoors, traveling, but most importantly, being connected with God. Hers was the house that the entire neighborhood went to, because she had a way of touching people's hearts through her kindness. She handmade her kids' clothes, handmade her friends' clothes, and even handmade her daughter's prom dresses. She's active in her church and in her kids' school. But one thing about Carol was she gave more than she received. She's my grandma. Now these people are very important to me. People who taught me things that I will never forget. And their stories have changed my entire perspective on life. But the things I told you are just brief parts of them. There is so much more to their story, and it's not just them. You have a story too. And I believe that people's stories are powerful, but in order to release that power, they must be told. Now, we might tell our story every day in small ways, whether it's telling your friends or family what happened at school or at home. But what about the things that are real? Your struggles, things that you might not want to share. Oftentimes, those things that you're embarrassed or ashamed to talk about could be the most impactful form of education. Psychologists say that personal stories engage our brain more easily than just a list of facts. Are you not convinced? Well, for the students in my class, can you please raise your hand if you could tell me when William Stanley was born? Okay, now who can remember when Mr. Ferdui went on his crazy fishing trip in Alaska? Now though, for those of you who don't know, Mr. Ferdui picked up a fishing job over the summer. He had to enjoy the weather, but he also had to enjoy the people he worked with, and they were not the kindest. They treated him poorly because of his faith. And when they would play trashy music or say awful and embarrassing things about him and to him, he endured it. We learned about William Stanley this year, and no one remembers it. But Mr. Ferdui told his story 2 years ago, and I still remember it, and these kids still remember it, because it taught us something that textbooks can't always teach. It taught us a life lesson, and that lesson I still apply to my life today. Why is that? Well, there's actually some science behind it. When you hear a story about someone overcoming a barrier or emerging a triumphant, it usually releases dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter responsible for feeling motivated and powerful. This is almost like when we watch the movie Karate Kid, and all of a sudden we too feel like we could be Mr. Miyagi. It's inspiring. But sharing your story isn't only inspirational. Another one of our teachers this year, Mr. Garcia, asked if we would rather learn from our own mistakes or others. Think about that. Think about a mistake you wish you never made. Maybe it was a bad financial decision, a relationship mistake, a life-altering mistake. Now, these mistakes are being made right now by your friends, your family, your students, your kids, but they can be easily avoided. A simple example of this is Dave, Timmy, and Anne. Now, Dave and Anne are taking a very difficult test, and Dave is struggling, and he looks over at Anne, who is almost finished with her test. And Dave knows that Anne is the smartest girl in class. So as the temptation grows, Dave begins peeking over at Anne's paper, but then abruptly stops as he remembers Timmy's very sad, unfortunate story about getting expelled after cheating on the test. Now I know this is a very simple example, but we all know that this can get much more serious. And your story, no matter if it's big or small like Timmy's, is a very important learning lesson for the people that you share it with. just like all history lessons. These stories stick with us because it teaches us something. But it also sticks with us because it's a personal experience. And telling yours can not only help guide others, inspire others, but it could also allow others to connect with you in a more deep and meaningful way. Nowadays, our romantic relationships are now called situationships, and our friendships have turned superficial and dry. We see this all over Instagram, TikTok, basically everywhere on social media. It is romanticized to have flings and start conversations with things like HRU for how are you, and answer with good, HBU for how about you. But it's almost never anything deep and meaningful. But imagine how much deepening your relationships could be with not only your significant other, but your family and your friends if you told them real things about you. Not just what you show on social media, not just the things you want people to see. And when you do that, you will find the more you are real with others, the more willing you are to tell your story and share things that you have overcome, or even the things that you're still struggling with, the more easier it is for others to be vulnerable with you, because that barrier of judgment falls. If you told me something that you were struggling with, that I have struggled with, or am struggling with too, my story could actually help you overcome your struggle, and I wouldn't feel judged, and you wouldn't feel judged, because we both have been there. And actually, research from field of narrative psychology shows that link between narratives and well-being, that exploring personal stories, reflecting on them, do make us vulnerable, but they also allow us to heal and grow. We can heal and grow from each other's stories, and we are meant to. James 5:16 says, "Confess your faults to one another, pray for one another, so that you may be healed." Schools, families, churches, we need to get real with each other and not just share superficial things. Because I promise you, your favorite food or your favorite color isn't going to tell me who you really are. These are not the relationships God wants us to have. God gave us each other for a reason. He gave you a story for a purpose. And sharing that story can not only educate others, inspire others, deepen your relationships with others, but it can also glorify God. Christians, this is a big deal for us. We have the power to actually save someone's life by bringing them to Christ. But we throw it away by throwing hell verses at them and calling them sinners. Taking that approach is not only going to push people further away from Christians, it's pushing them further away from God. Isn't that sad? Because it happens all the time. And we wonder why people call Christians liars and hypocrites. It's because we call out their sin, their life, their story, without acknowledging our own story of sin. If you want to bring someone to God, I believe the most beneficial approaches to this is being real with them, relating to them so that they don't feel alone. When you share your testimony, when you tell your story, you aren't glorifying yourself or that sin that you used to live in. You're glorifying how God worked in your life to change you for the better. You're glorifying God. Greg Laurie, C.S. Lewis, Liev Strobel, they're all familiar to us, right? They are some of the most famous Christians. People look up to them. I look up to them. But they're not perfect. They're people who lived in the worst of sin. Drugs, lust, denying God. And when they shared their story, it became evidence of God's power. It changed people's perspectives on life. It allowed people to relate to them and realize that they too can be saved by God. And all they had to do was share it. But you know what? Nobody's life would have been changed if there was nobody listening. An African proverb says, when an old man dies, a library burns. That library is filled with life lessons, knowledge, key to successes, guidance, culture, and so much more. And we are allowing it to be burned to the ground because we aren't curious, because we don't ask, because we don't listen. This year in speech class, we had to come up with these things called life moments. We acted them out in front of the class to help us deal with difficult situations. One of the most common one was how to get out of a conversation with someone who doesn't know how to stop talking. Now, I'm sure we can all agree that this is a very important one. But what would happen if we just let that person talk? Just to hear what they had to say. Maybe just so that they could feel heard. Now, don't get me wrong. I love to talk, and it is very possible that one of those life lessons were made because I don't know how to stop talking. I love to go on, and sometimes I struggle with listening because I'm constantly thinking about what am I going to say next, or I wonder if I said something wrong, or I wonder how I can use what I learned in speech class to get out of this conversation. But if there was anyone I loved talking most with, it was talking with my grandma. Because she listens, and I can go on, and she would sit there and truly listen. She isn't thinking about what she's going to say next. She's asking more questions, relating to me, and always wanting to hear more. So, as you can imagine, I was very excited for the 2-hour drive I had with her. And it started, and I ranted, but then I decided to make her feel the way she makes me feel. Heard. And listen, all I had to do was ask one simple question. How are you really doing? By the end of my drive, my grandma was in tears, and I was too. I found out things about my grandma I never knew. Her childhood, her struggles, her battles now. I learned very important lessons that day in just that 2-hour drive. I learned I wasn't alone in the things I was struggling with. I learned through her story how I too could overcome. She told me she now sees a therapist, which is good, but I can't help but wonder if she wouldn't have to if maybe people would listen to her the way she listens to others. For this speech, I thought I was going to have to interview people to hear their stories, but I'm really glad I didn't, because my grandma probably wouldn't have been as vulnerable. All I had to do was listen, and I heard her story. I learned from her, I was inspired by her, and that day our relationship grew deeper. Now, I know it is much easier to get out of these conversations because they could get very uncomfortable. And maybe it's easier to zone them out and not listen, and it can be very challenging to be open with someone. But imagine how much you can learn from someone, how much you could deepen your relationship with them, how much you could even help them or bring them to Christ by just telling your story. Listen, you can't know someone's struggles, their culture, their lessons, their library, by just looking at them. And sometimes all it takes is listening, even for a 2-hour drive. I am so thankful for these people, not only them, but the stories that they have shared with me. But at first glance, we might all agree that they just look like the rest of the 7 billion people in the world. They look average. Your average old man, your average sister, your average grandma. But if these average people's stories have the power to impact others' lives, so does yours. So tell it.
Well, that was excellent. And anyone that's had me in a history class knows that I kept saying it was millions of stories, and that's really all that history is. I am interested if, in your personal experience, maybe in some of the reading you've done, have you noticed a disconnect between the youngest generations and the oldest generations? Like, you have this great relationship with your grandmother, you asked her questions, you spoke to her. I'm wondering if you're seeing with technology and all that's going on that there aren't, those opportunities taken perhaps as they used to be when times were maybe a little simpler, to sit down at the feet of a grandparent or at a dinner, sit down and talk to them and listen. Is there a disconnect between sort of the polar end opposite generations now?
Yeah, I absolutely believe so. I mean, I see it all the time. I work at a restaurant, and I'll see like an older, gentleman or woman, like a grandpa or grandma, and then I see this kid and they're eating, and the grandpa or grandma, they're just staring at the kid and they're just on their phones, and it's honestly really sad because like that's the time that you could use. I mean, like I said, it was just a 2-hour drive, and I've known my grandma for 18 years and I never really knew her because I never took the time to listen to her, and I feel like because of technology and, like how you're saying, that's definitely a barrier there.
Excellent. Well, 10 words or less. What did you take away from this experience?
Don't let that old man's library burn down.
I
I don't have a question, but great job.
Thank you.
I'm interested to know where your interest in stories came from.
I don't know, I've always kind of liked stories, but honestly, like, probably one of the main, like, push is probably, honestly, my mom, she's over there, but she's always shared her story with other people, and I've just seen how it's worked through her life. You know, she has also an incredible story. And just it allows her to relate to people and connect with others, just like I've never seen that before. And just growing up with that, honestly, it really made me passionate about it. And she was even going to write a book on how you can't, you know, judge people because you never know where they come from. And so she would always like preach that to me, and I think that made me really passionate about it.
Amen. Great job, Ivy. I don't have a question.